The rhythmic thudding of rotor blades sliced through the still morning air, echoing over the calm lake surface as a bright orange Coast Guard helicopter hovered just above my dock, preparing to land. But then, without warning, it swerved sharply left and soared back into the sky, as if startled by something. Bewildered, I stepped out onto my porch with my coffee in hand, only to spot a freshly nailed sign in place of the official emergency marker. In bold red letters, it screamed, "No trespassing HOA property." I was stunned. I hadn't authorized any changes to that dock, especially not something as outrageous as that sign. For over a decade, that exact spot had served as a designated emergency landing zone for the Coast Guard. And now someone had the audacity to deface it. Then I saw her, standing smugly on the shore, waving with a self-satisfied smirk. In one hand she held a hammer, in the other a mug of tea. It was Karen from the HOA, naturally. She mouthed, "You're welcome," as if she had just pulled off a heroic act. What she didn't realize was that she had just tampered with federal property. The day had begun peacefully. Birds chirping, the lake still as glass, that crisp scent of dew in the air. I had just brewed a fresh pot of coffee and was looking forward to finishing some remote work before heading out on my boat. That dock wasn't just a personal amenity. It was a vital piece of infrastructure. Years ago, after a devastating flood, FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security had partnered with select private landowners, including myself, to designate and reinforce critical rescue points. Mine was one of them. I'd spent time and money working with federal engineers to upgrade the dock, adding reinforced steel, installing proper GPS markers, and getting it formally registered for emergency use. That structure wasn't just for leisure. It was a lifeline. So seeing that absurd sign tacked onto one of the pylons made my blood pressure spike. I walked briskly down the gravel path, half hoping I was mistaken, that maybe some kids had pulled a prank. But no. As I got closer, I saw the HOA's laminated emblem stapled to the bottom of the sign, complete with Karen's unmistakable Sharpa signature. Below it, a typed warning, "Unauthorized dock activity subject to fines." I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Then her voice rang out behind me. I did what had to be done. You can't just let people use community land. I turned to find her standing in full yoga attire, clipboard in hand, sun hat perched like a crown. Since her recent election as HOA president, thanks mostly to her relentless talking and lavender bush promises, Karen had made it her mission to enforce every minor code in the book. She'd banned porch swings longer than 5 feet, called a vintage bike rack a trip hazard, and now, evidently, decided my dock needed her personal blessing. I stayed calm and told her plainly. The dock wasn't HOA property. It was private, and more importantly, it was part of a federally registered emergency response system. Her response? A dismissive snort. "Oh, come on. You expect me to believe that little fishing plank is some kind of James Bond landing pad? What's next? Spy submarines. It might have been funny if it weren't so dangerous." I showed her the sticker from DHS and the Coast Guard that had been ripped off earlier. I even handed her a printed copy of the formal agreement I had with the emergency services. She rolled her eyes and sneered. "Looks like Photoshop. Next time try a better font." At that point, I knew logic was wasted on her. She wasn't interested in facts. She was addicted to power. So I walked back into the house and placed a call to Commander Nolan at the Regional Coast Guard office. The moment I explained the situation, especially the aborted helicopter landing and the unauthorized sign, his tone shifted. He assured me a team would be there within hours to inspect the site and take action. By early afternoon, 2 uniformed Coast Guard officers arrived with clipboards and radios. Their expressions made it clear they weren't here for small-town politics. I met them at the gate and led them to the dock, where Karen had parked herself in a lawn chair like she owned the lake. Her sun hat was pulled low, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. When she spotted the officers, she straightened up quickly and greeted them with a rehearsed charm. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I assume you're here to support our efforts to maintain safety in the community." The taller officer ignored the pleasantries. "Ma'am, did you place this sign here?" he asked. "Yes," she said proudly. "I'm the HOA president. This area isn't safe for random use. His face didn't change. "This dock is a federally designated emergency site. Your sign caused an incoming chopper to abort a scheduled landing. That's a serious violation." Karen tried to laugh it off. "Well, no one told me about that. Shouldn't there be some kind of paperwork or official notice?" I handed the officer the exact documentation she'd dismissed earlier. He reviewed it, nodded, then began taking photos of the sign and surrounding area. Moments later, he radioed in an update. Within 10 minutes, a Coast Guard patrol boat arrived and docked beside us. Another officer joined the team. Karen, by now, was pacing nervously, repeatedly asking if she was being arrested, even though no one had suggested that. But her panic tone said it all. She knew she'd gone too far, and this time her usual charm and yoga mat wouldn't get her out of it. They handed her a formal warning and firmly told her to take down all the unauthorized signage. She flat out refused, muttering, "I'll have my cousin look into this. He's a municipal law expert." The officers didn't argue. They simply informed her that any further attempts to interfere would lead to obstruction charges under federal statutes, and depending on the situation, could even fall under Homeland Security's domain. Her face drained of color. For once, she had no snarky comeback. Without another word, the officers removed the sign themselves, documenting every step. They reinstalled the Coast Guard emergency marker in its original place and even added a QR code linking directly to the Federal Registry for Emergency Landing Zones. Karen stood by, seething but saying nothing. After they left, she marched up to me, face red with fury, and hissed, "You think this is over? I run this neighborhood. You're going to regret making me look weak." I didn't take the bait. I walked down the dock and checked the markings, making sure everything was secure. Still, something gnawed at me. This wasn't finished. Karen wasn't the type to back off. She was the kind who doubled down, who treated rules like suggestions and consequences like challenges. I realized I'd need more than just the truth on my side. I needed cameras, witnesses, documentation, real armor, because HOA Karens don't retreat. They rewrite the rules and hammer them into your walls like it's the Dark Ages. What she didn't know was that the Coast Guard wasn't letting this slide. They were kicking the issue up to their internal legal teams. And I wasn't done either. This had evolved beyond a squabble over dock space. It was now about drawing the line between personal authority and public accountability. And Karen? She was about to learn what happens when you try to block a federal safety measure with a cheap wooden sign and a yoga mat. But the quiet that followed didn't last. The next morning, someone slipped a letter under my door. An official-looking HOA notice, her signature looped at the bottom like she was signing a party invitation. It declared an emergency board meeting to vote on unauthorized use and alteration of shared community property. She had the gall to refer to my dock, a privately owned, federally registered emergency landing zone, as if it were a stray piece of lawn furniture from the clubhouse patio. And the kicker? The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. that very day, clearly chosen to catch me off guard. She always timed these things when she thought I'd be working or off-site with the Coast Guard. But this time I was prepared. When I walked into the clubhouse, the energy in the room shifted. Half the board members avoided looking at me, and a few residents had clearly shown up without knowing what the meeting was actually about. Karen was already at the front, standing by a dry erase board labeled Community Dock Concerns. A list of phony bullet points was scribbled beneath it. She smiled smugly and addressed me in a syrupy tone. "Oh, look who made it. We were just reviewing safety risks linked to unregulated structures." I took a seat in the back and let her ramble. She spoke about soil erosion, non-existent electrical hazards, and the danger of slippery surfaces. Then came her big finale. She held up a so-called neighborhood survey allegedly showing that most residents wanted the dock removed and turned over to the HOA due to safety risks. Of course, the signatures weren't dated, and half of them belonged to her book club pals. Then came the vote. Karen raised her hand. One by one, her usual crew followed, nodding like puppets. All but one, Greg. He hesitated. A retired officer with common sense and a low tolerance for drama. Greg didn't move. Just as Karen was about to gloat, I stood up. I calmly thanked them for the opportunity to speak, even though they hadn't given me one, and stated clearly that the dock in question sat on privately held land and had been formally registered as a federal resource. The room fell quiet. Karen's smug expression flickered, and just like that, the tide began to turn. Maintained entirely at my own cost and under the direct oversight of the United States Coast Guard, I laid out the full documentation in front of them. Every paper was there. Copies of the official memorandum, photographs showing the dock's structural upgrades done in coordination with the Coast Guard, registration ID numbers, and a signed letter from Commander Nolan confirming its designation. Silence swept across the room. Karen folded her arms, scowled, and muttered, "Anybody can type something up and make it look official." That's when I revealed the final piece. Certified letters from the Coast Guard's regional legal office. They clearly warned that any interference with the dock, be it signs, tampering, or blocking emergency access, would be considered a violation under maritime security law and treated as a federal offense. She snatched one of the letters, scanning it for a loophole, but found none. It was notarized and unmistakably legitimate. The message was simple. If she or the HOA made one more move against the dock, federal prosecutors would be the ones knocking, not me. That's when Greg, a reserved HOA board member and retired logistics officer, cleared his throat. "I've seen plenty of paperwork in my day," he said. "This is authentic. We'd be insane to push back." Karen's jaw locked tight, the realization hitting her. But true to her nature, she didn't retreat. She escalated. Later that night, reviewing footage from my security system, I saw figures creeping near the dock. Two teens, one of them unmistakably Karen's nephew, were trying to spray over the official Coast Guard markings. The other kid was fiddling with dock bolts, apparently trying to loosen them. I shouted through the speaker and activated the floodlights. They bolted, but not before my cameras got crystal clear images of their faces. I documented everything and followed protocol, forwarding the video to Commander Nolan. He replied quickly, "This now qualifies as a federal obstruction. We're escalating." The next morning, Karen came storming toward my house, shouting about illegal surveillance and claiming I'd harassed minors. I calmly told her my cameras were fully legal, positioned on my private property, and that the footage showed individuals tampering with a federal installation. Not a teenage prank, but a federal crime. She stormed off, hands trembling. That evening, a Coast Guard legal liaison personally delivered a cease and desist letter to Karen. He didn't hand it to her discreetly. It was done in full view of the neighborhood. The letter applied not just to her, but to every member of the HOA board, forbidding them from interfering with the dock or surrounding land. Penalties included fines, criminal charges, and possible civil liability. I hadn't asked them to take it that far, but Karen had backed them into a corner. News spread fast. Neighbors started whispering, and people who once sided with Karen began pulling away. Stories surfaced about how she tried to fine someone for flying a flag, shut down a kid's lemonade stand for being commercial, and even threatened a disabled veteran over his service dog. Her support base was unraveling. One board member even approached me in private, saying they thought she was bluffing. But she wasn't done. Karen called for another emergency HOA meeting, this time with a new scheme. Since the dock couldn't be used by the community, she argued it was now a visual nuisance and should be condemned. She passed around exaggerated photos that made the dock look decayed and unstable, even though I just repainted it and had full structural clearance from the Coast Guard. I didn't show up alone. 2 uniformed Coast Guard officers accompanied me. They stayed silent at the back until Karen started pushing her false narrative. When she claimed the dock was unsafe, one of the officers stepped forward. "This dock is compliant with federal standards," he said flatly. "It's storm-rated and structurally certified." That shut the room down. Karen's voice faltered. She was losing the grip she once had. Still, I didn't feel entirely at ease. I knew her too well. Karen didn't retreat, she schemed. She wouldn't go down quietly. I left the meeting knowing she had something else up her sleeve, and it wouldn't be subtle. For 3 days, things went eerily quiet. Karen didn't come near the dock. Her house stayed lit through the night, and I noticed a new sprinkler system pointing at my yard. Motion activated, naturally. On the surface, she'd backed off, but I knew better. She was just waiting. Then came Saturday. I first saw the smoke while pouring my morning coffee, thick gray plumes rising from across the lake. Within moments, my phone was lighting up with messages. A tourist boat had caught fire. A gas canister ignited during someone's barbecue. A family of 6 was stranded, the flames climbing, the boat drifting. There was only one viable place for rescue crews to land, my dock. I sprinted outside, pulled off the cable lock I'd added after the last sabotage attempt, and set the Coast Guard emergency beacon at the dock's edge. The rescue team was already airborne. But then I saw it. Just up the path from the dock, Karen had set up a full-blown event. Tents, speakers, tables, snacks, and signs that read, HLA Family Safety Day. It looked innocent, festive, even charming. But it was strategically placed to block access to the dock. She waved at me like it was all a coincidence. I yelled to clear the path. She yelled back, claiming it was a harmless community event and telling me to land elsewhere. She knew what she was doing. Without delay, I radioed the Coast Guard and informed them the access route was obstructed. They confirmed the blockage and diverted temporarily while ground support moved in. Minutes later, a patrol boat crossed the lake, emergency personnel aboard. They didn't ask questions. They moved fast. The officers and rescue crew tore through the barricade like it wasn't even there. One officer clipped Karen's decorative balloons without hesitation, ignoring her screams of protest. This wasn't about a neighborhood feud anymore, it was about lives on the line. And Karen had tried to block a federal rescue. Decorations? This is private property. The officer's voice turned cold. Ma'am, you are actively interfering with an emergency response. Step back or you will be detained. That shut her up. For once, Karen had no comeback. She took a step back, stunned. Within seconds, the dock was cleared, and the rescue began in earnest. The helicopter lowered just enough to drop rescue gear, while the patrol boat assisted in pulling the scorched vessel to shore. The family aboard was shaken but alive, their skin mottled with minor burns and smoke inhalation. The father, who had tried fighting the flames with bottled water, embraced the responders like they'd pulled him from the jaws of hell. I stood quietly at the end of the dock, watching, knowing this wasn't over. The security cameras along the perimeter had captured everything. Karen's interference, her makeshift tents, the shouting, and, most damning of all, her telling the officer to land elsewhere. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the treetops and the lake returned to stillness, a black SUV pulled into Karen's driveway. A man in a federal-issue windbreaker stepped out, accompanied by a uniformed officer. They rang her doorbell. Neighbors watched from behind curtains and porch railings as though the whole thing were a live TV drama. Karen answered the door, and her smile vanished the second she saw the federal seal on the folder the man was holding. She tried to keep up appearances, even offered them iced tea. But they weren't there for conversation. They handed her a legal citation for obstruction during a federal rescue operation. Not a warning. A formal charge with a court summons. The neighborhood chat threads lit up instantly. Screenshots from the scene circulated. Karen shouting, officers standing their ground. Someone turned it into a meme. Karen holding a "No helicopters allowed" sign while flames raged behind her. People who'd once sat on the fence began speaking up. Comments read, "She's gone too far. And if this is what the HOA stands for, count me out." But Karen, being Karen, didn't retreat. That night, she went on Facebook, publishing a rambling post loaded with flimsy legal theories and veiled accusations. She claimed emotional trauma and insisted the Coast Guard had exceeded its authority. Most of the replies called her out, some mocking, others correcting her misstatements. One even pointed out that interfering with a federal operation during an active emergency can result in prison time. The post vanished within hours, but not before dozens had taken screenshots. The next morning, I got a call from Commander Nolan himself. He thanked me for staying involved and confirmed that an internal review had begun. Karen's name had been flagged and was being sent to Homeland Security for their civilian interference watch list. No arrest for now, but the fallout was gaining weight. The Coast Guard would return within the week. This time, the dock would be repainted with unmistakable federal insignia. Clear signage would be added, along with a real-time beacon connected via satellite. There would be no more debate. At the clubhouse, the tone had changed. Karen summoned everyone for an emergency HOA meeting. But only a few showed up. Most board members made excuses: illness, family obligations. Greg, the only rational voice on the board, stood up and walked out midway through Karen's tirade about federal overreach. One by one, her influence was fading. She tried to pin it all on me, whispering that I had engineered everything, twisting things from behind the scenes. But no one was listening anymore. Instead, neighbors approached me directly. Some brought coffee. Others offered to help repaint the dock. One elderly woman, a resident for over 4 decades, quietly said, "You're the first one who ever stood up to her and made it count." Thank you. I didn't feel heroic, just exhausted. But something had shifted for real this time. Karen had crossed a line she couldn't return from. Her authority was smoke and mirrors, and now the curtain had been pulled. The dock was intact. The family was safe. But this wasn't finished. Karen didn't know how to back down. She only knew how to double down. And her next move? I had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to involve signs or social media. Something worse was coming. I could feel it. Courts, codes, and all the chaos, but now I had something she couldn't manipulate. The will of the people, federal backing, and a camera rolling 24/7. Let her try something now. In the days that followed the rescue, the neighborhood felt changed. Not just quiet, but charged, like everyone was bracing for something. Seeing the helicopters land, emergency personnel swarming the dock, it shook people. It reminded them this wasn't some perfectly curated postcard town run on lemonade stands and lawn gossip. It was part of a larger, very real world. And Karen, either too proud or too blind to see it, had nearly cost lives trying to flex power she never had. But she wasn't done. Far from it. She regrouped. It started with a neatly printed notice, pinned to the clubhouse bulletin board and dropped into mailboxes in flimsy plastic sleeves. She called it a Community Accountability Summit, hosted by none other than herself. The flyer was worded just ambiguously enough to avoid any legal blowback, but its purpose was obvious. She was rebranding, trying to pass herself off as a misunderstood safety advocate. She even tried to frame the Coast Guard citation as a smear campaign. Free coffee and snacks were her bait. And against better judgment, curiosity got the better of people. Nearly half the neighborhood showed up, waiting to see what circus she'd try to run this time. I stayed at the back, arms crossed, watching. Karen stood at the front like a political hopeful, blouse crisp, posture stiff. She launched into a speech about community values and resisting external threats. Not once did she mention the fire, the rescue, or her interference. Just vague allusions to procedural confusion and recent challenges. Then came the real agenda. A proposal to reassess all legacy structures in the HOA zone for compliance. In other words, she wanted to purge everything she didn't control. Right in her slideshow, she flashed a blurred image of my dock. Barely obscured, but instantly recognizable. Then she introduced her legal advisor. A man shuffled forward in a wrinkled suit, his confidence unraveling by the second. He spouted jargon, terms like non-conforming assets and variance protocols. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became. This wasn't a legal expert. He fumbled when questioned, misquoted basic municipal law, and stumbled over definitions. When asked point-blank if he was licensed, he dodged. Asked his specialty, he admitted, barely audible, that he was a bankruptcy paralegal from a different county. The mood shifted fast. Greg, the retired military officer on the board, stood up and said what everyone was thinking. "I've seen more convincing scams during boot camp." That was the turning point. Even Karen's allies started eyeing her warily. She raised her voice, tried blaming misinformation. But it was over. She'd brought in a fraud to prop up a lie. I didn't need to say anything. The truth had all the traction it needed. The next day, Greg and 2 other board members formally submitted a motion to remove her from her position as HOA president. They had the signatures and support was growing. A vote was scheduled. Karen panicked. She launched into overdrive, Fake online accounts praising her leadership, slandering the board, questioning the legality of the vote. But her IP address betrayed her. One of the forum moderators called her out publicly. Her secret was exposed. It was like watching a levee break. Years of ego and bullying crumbling under the weight of her own lies. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard returned to my dock. They replaced the signage with official markers, laminated warnings, satellite-synced IDs, even a small device that blinked blue when rescue protocols were triggered nearby. It looked more official than ever. Kids stopped to ask questions. Some residents brought snacks to the officers. A mother, one whose children had been near the water the day of the fire, came to me misty-eyed and said, "I didn't realize how important that dock was until now. Thank you for standing your ground." But Karen wasn't done swinging. The morning of the vote, she tried to halt everything with a cease and desist. Not against the board, but against me. She accused me of fostering a toxic environment, interfering with HOA business. She included blurry Facebook screenshots and rescue photos as evidence, along with a letter she'd sent the Coast Guard demanding a retraction. I laughed. It read like a meltdown disguised in legal language. I didn't have to fight it alone. The Coast Guard's legal team responded quickly, firmly rejecting her claims and warning her that further attempts to intimidate or defame could bring real consequences. That was the final nail. The vote took place that evening. The room was packed. Chairs dragged from garages, people lined up in doorways. Karen, red-eyed but still trying to smile, gave one last speech about loyalty and vision. She insisted she only wanted to protect the neighborhood. Then Greg stood. He didn't need theatrics, just facts. He listed the unauthorized signage, the obstruction of rescue operations, the false legal claims, the slander and abuse of power. Then came the vote. 34 hands went up. Only one remained down, hers. Karen was officially out. She stood there a moment, as if expecting someone to come to her defense. No one did. She grabbed her clipboard, muttered something bitter, and left. And just like that, the storm passed. Later, I stood outside, watching the sunset paint the lake in gold. The dock stood there, more than just wood and nails now. It was a symbol of standing up, of protecting something real. I knew Karen wouldn't disappear. People like her never did. They lurked, brooded, plotted. But the neighborhood was awake now. The spell had been broken. There'd be no quiet takeover next time. If she tried again, she'd face a community ready to push back, backed by truth, accountability, and a dock that didn't flinch when it mattered. Let her write her rants. Let her file her papers. She lost the only thing that made her dangerous, the illusion that no one would stand up to her. And I made sure that illusion was gone for good. They say peace doesn't arrive with a trumpet. It arrives quietly, after the noise fades. The turning point came when someone posted a simple message, "Community over control." No one tore it down. It was like a valve had been released. The tension that had strangled every HOA meeting, every note on the community board, began to loosen. People started smiling more. Conversations on the street didn't carry the edge they once did. But while the rest of us moved forward, Karen didn't. She withdrew into her house like a dethroned monarch, blinds shut tight, car parked with military precision, daring anyone to challenge her place in the neighborhood. But she wasn't idle. Karen was regrouping, scheming, looking for a final way to reclaim what she thought she'd lost. And when her next move came, it was so absurd I didn't even know how to react. She mailed out a letter, this time not from the HOA or any governing body. It was from her. Heavy black text, laminated like it was a piece of sacred law. She declared the creation of a new organization, the Neighborhood Preservation Committee, the NPC. She insisted it was a moral watchdog group, not a governing body, and its first order of business. My doc. Attached was a bizarre list of fabricated offenses, unauthorized paint shades, invasive bird species, shoreline obstruction. She even included a faux fine schedule. I laughed when I read it. I assumed it was some kind of joke, until I saw her the next morning. There she was, in a reflective vest, flanked by 2 of her yoga buddies, striding along my property line with clipboards and flags. One of them was measuring the shrubbery like they were scouting for a home renovation show. I walked out with my coffee, leaned on the porch rail and waited. She greeted me with a polite smile and said, "Just logging some potential violations by the shoreline. Nothing personal. We're all about transparency these days." I asked her if she was seriously forming a rogue HOA after being thrown out of the real one. She answered, stone-faced, "It's not a governing body. It's a civic coalition. Entirely legal." I didn't argue. Instead, I made a call. Not to the Coast Guard this time, but to a reporter friend who had followed the doc story from the start. When I told him what Karen was doing, posing as a public authority, issuing imaginary citations, stalking the lakefront, he laughed so hard I thought he'd drop his phone. 2 days later, the article hit the web. Headline: Ex-HOA head creates fake watchdog group, targets Coast Guard doc. It exploded across social media. The attached photo of Karen, arms crossed, smirking beside the lake, became a meme overnight. She tried to spin it, of course. Posted a lengthy Facebook rant claiming the media misquoted her, that she was being smeared, that she just wanted to bring structure back to the community. But this time, no one bought it. Not even her usual supporters. Her yoga partners quietly disappeared from her committee and began showing up at HOA-sponsored events instead. Her influence had collapsed. She was isolated and everyone could see it. To officially close the chapter, the HOA put together a public celebration. Coast Guard Appreciation Day. It was part symbolism, part gratitude. After all, that dock had saved lives. The Coast Guard agreed to participate. On the morning of the event, a full patrol boat pulled up to the dock. Officers in uniform greeted families, shared water safety tips, and handed out emergency supplies. Kids sat in the captain's chair for photos. Parents asked questions. There was laughter, music, hot dogs, lemonade. The dock, once a symbol of petty power struggles, was now the heart of something truly meaningful. Karen didn't attend, but she was watching. I saw her face through a gap in the blinds, motionless as ever. I don't know what ran through her mind watching a life vest being handed to a child or neighbors she'd once scolded sharing food and jokes. Maybe regret, maybe bitterness, but she stayed inside. Then came the final twist. A letter arrived in my mailbox, this time from a legal office downtown. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't a summons. It was an invitation. The Coast Guard had nominated my property for a federal designation as an official community partnership site. Only a few civilian locations ever received this. It came with formal recognition, priority emergency response status, and even a small yearly stipend for maintenance. I accepted without hesitation. A week later, a sleek metal plaque was installed on a reinforced post by the dock. It bore the seal of the Department of Homeland Security and the United States Coast Guard. It was permanent with a QR code linking to the federal database. It wasn't just a sign. It was proof. Couldn't be removed. Couldn't be challenged. That morning, as a few neighbors gathered for photos and coffee, I stood quietly, watching the team secure the plaque in place. The air felt lighter, cleaner. Not because Karen was gone, but because the noise she brought had finally been silenced. Later, on a casual walk past her house, I noticed the porch light flickering. The grass was overgrown. Her prized flower beds, once micromanaged to death, had become wild and patchy. It looked abandoned, like even she had stopped caring. And I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt finished. There was something sad about it all. She had wrapped her entire sense of worth in control, rules, enforcement, order. Without that, she didn't know how to just be a neighbor. Eventually, the saga slipped from everyday conversation. Life moved on. But every so often, I'd see someone new pausing at the dock, reading the plaque. I'd tell them the short version. A neighborhood tried to micromanage what it didn't understand, and one woman took it too far. But in the end, law, purpose, and people who cared held the line. Karen still lives here. She doesn't run meetings. She doesn't patrol bushes. She walks her dog once a week, gives a polite nod, and returns home, like a ghost haunting the shell of a title that no longer exists. The dock still stands. The plaque still shines. And if danger ever returns, The Coast Guard won't hesitate. They know exactly where to go. One half.